So those are the three things you have to remember if you're graphing functions, and specifically they're polynomial functions, right? So this is a polynomial function. So first, let's identify three things as I mentioned. So if you're looking at this negative sign right here, that indicates that you have a negative leading coefficient, right? And you're probably wondering right now, what does the leading coefficient and its sign has to do with drawing or graphing the function, right? So if it's a negative leading coefficient, so we're going to have that right here. So leading coefficient. So if it's a negative leading coefficient, that means when you're graphing your function. So for example, if you're looking at a linear function, which is y is equal to x, say for example, versus y is equal to negative x. So we know that if you're graphing y is equal to x versus y is equal to negative x, if it's a linear function, that means your line is passing quadrant 3, right? Because this is quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4, versus something like y is equal to negative x, which is quadrant 2 and quadrant 4. Does that make sense? So the negative leading coefficient or the positive leading coefficient would determine whether your function is passing quadrant 1 and 3, if it's let's say y is equal to x, versus quadrant 2 and 4 when it's a negative leading coefficient. Same thing really applies for example, y is equal to x cubed, right? Which is what we know is an odd function, right? So we have something like this. So we know that it's quadrant 3 and quadrant 1 when it's positive, and if it's negative x cubed, we know that this is quadrant 2 and quadrant 4. And guess what? It's similar to y is equal to x squared, right? So let's just scroll down just to see and compare them. So y is equal to x squared. This is going to be on quadrant 2 and quadrant 1, right? And if you have y is equal to negative x squared, you're going to have that on quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. Does that make sense? So it matters where you're going to graph that. Okay, so I can erase this now. So that's for the sign of the leading coefficient. So let's move on to multiplicity versus degree. So you've probably heard what multiplicity is, and also zeros, right? Zeros and multiplicity are related to one another. So for example, you're looking at x, right? So first of all, you have x minus 3, and you have x plus 4, right? So your zeros are going to be 0, right? Because x is a 0. And you have positive 3 and negative 4. So maybe we can just group this based on the smallest versus the largest. So we have negative 4 to begin with because it's x plus 4 is equal to 0. Therefore, you're going to get negative 4, right? And then you have 0, comma 3, right? 0 for your x minus 3 is equal to 3, right? So in that case, you're going to see that the multiplicity of x plus 4 is going to be 1, right? So what is multiplicity? So multiplicity is when you're looking at different terms, and then you call this sort of like an exponent. So if you look at x plus 4, your exponent right